All right, thanks for coming, everyone. So, as far as how I chose my topic, I'm very interested in economic research, and one of my favorite economists, Ross Chetty, when he was in high school, he wrote a paper on Time on the Cross, which was a book about American slavery. So, because of that, I've read an interview with him, and he talked about it, which I thought was pretty interesting. So, I ended up reading the book over the summer. And as far as picking my integrative topic, I once had an idea about looking at the relationship between economic inequality and resulting volatility, but it seemed like that was a little bit too theory intensive. What I like about my topic, which is the economics of American slavery, is that it involves theory and I have a mathematical model, but it's also very much grounded in evidence. So quite broadly, my paper is about the economics of American slavery. And as a bit of a background, slavery was a stronghold institution that dominated the socio-economic landscape of the American South. A large share of capital and even people were tied up literally and figuratively, unfortunately, in the consuming slavery system. So because of this, because of the strength and the importance of slavery to the American South, it follows that the system must have had some sort of long-run impact on the economic trends and patterns that we see today. And the most conspicuous of these trends and patterns is what I call the North-South Divergence, which is what my paper is about. So the North-South Divergence is the fact that since 1840, since even before the Civil War, the North has done much better economically than the South, whether we look at GDP per capita, healthcare, education, any metric, so on and so forth. So to investigate this trend, my paper tackles the following question. What sort of causal link can be drawn between the institution of American slavery and the resulting North-South divergence? That is to say, slavery caused the South to do worse economically than the North. And in response to this question, my paper takes the affirmative. Yes, slavery hurt the South in the long run. This is because the incentives that slave owners had, and slave owners controlled much of the capital in the South and much of the wealth, their incentives led them to act in their socially driven self-interest rather than making decisions that would have led to economic growth. In simple terms, they focused on prestige and power to a fault at the expense of the region's long-term economic growth, and that's why today we see that the South is much worse than the North economically. Now, two examples of this. First, in the decision to educate slaves, we can see this pattern. Slave owners denied slaves education systematically out of a fear that this would spoil them and lead them to become too powerful, too intelligent. We know this through first-hand sources, such as the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. Even though a higher level of education would have benefited the South in the long run, slave owners systematically denied slaves education again so that they wouldn't become too powerful, so that they could achieve what I call vertical prestige. That is prestige relative to people who are beneath you. Essentially, they were amplifying this disparity between the rich and the poor in the South and between whites and blacks. Secondly, slave owners denied blacks the opportunity, denied African Americans the opportunity to climb the occupational pyramid. We know through Time on the Cross, which is a book by Robert Fogel written in 1974, that slave owners bought a lot of products in the North, even though slaves could have produced them in the South at a cheaper cost, because they didn't want slaves to achieve a higher level of technical expertise and technological skills. Now, these decisions by slave owners, which were made in their self-interest and which were made as a result of socially driven incentives, don't really seem like it would be conducive to long-run economic growth. And my paper takes a stance that this is true. These decisions led the South to do worse economically than the North. Now, my paper deals with this in two respects. First, most of my paper, the bulk of my paper, is a qualitative argument that uses primary sources from historians, from economists, from mathematicians, that try to get a bunch of different viewpoints on the issue of slavery and how this affected the South. And secondly, I've designed a mathematical model, which you can see in the paper that I emailed to the students yesterday. And at this time, I'll yield time to questions.
Thank you.
All right, Tonna, so let's start with the fundamental weakness of your paper.
All right.
There's a lot of talk about math, and I see equations, but you haven't actually done any equations. You haven't added the numbers in, and you haven't actually done the math, so this looks mostly just sort of like I'm going to throw some math at a historical problem. How do you deal with that?
The purpose of my mathematical model is to get a conceptual look, a different conceptual look at the issue of slavery. Now, I could deal with this through a qualitative argument that would simply be semantics, but I think that the mathematical model has the effect of making it more robust. Now, that's not to say that this mathematical model is the be-all and end-all, if that's the right way to say that phrase. It's just a conceptual way of looking at it from a different perspective. Now, if you look at the end of my mathematical model, I include a list of questions that could be answered in subsequent research, one of which is figuring out the exact proportions of A and B, which were the two key variables that I used in my research. So I think that the mathematical model is the start of a process that allows us to quantify these social incentives.
Okay. will we ever be able to get A and B, or is that a fool's hope to try to dredge up 19th century data so that we can actually have to test out your theorems to see if they actually work?
So I think what's interesting about that, and what allows me to, what would allow researchers to get that data, even though we can't time travel back to the 19th century, is that there are analogous situations to the issue of slavery in the American South today. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a high degree of tribalism. And as a result of that, economic agents, that is to say people with economic power, make decisions in their own self-interest to put down members of other ethnic groups, right? So if we take data or run randomized control experiments like Esther Duflo does, which is an economist at MIT, and we can be able to understand what percentage of people's decisions are made based on socially driven self-interest, right? And after all, although the situation was a little bit different in the American South with slavery, we're human after all, we're the same species, we operate under the same fundamental truths and rules and biological frameworks.
So upstreaming, using 21st century data to try to get to 19th century sort of numbers.
First, we can do that, but also the good thing about the sources that I used, Time on the Cross, The Political Economy of Slavery, all sorts of books about that, is that the people who wrote those books were pioneers of a field that is called cliometrics. So because of that, they were the first people to look at the data and actually understand from a first-hand perspective, or at least from a second-hand perspective, how people acted in the slavery system. So they have a high degree of data that can be used if it's properly applied.
Can we bring the regions to parity? Can the South ever catch up to the North?
Yes, so that's one of the broadest questions of economic development, which is one of the major subfields of economics. How do we make rich countries, poor countries rich? How do we make poor regions rich? And that has to do with a lot of things. Number one, the South could increase their human capital, which is what I talked about in my paper. There could be educational investments. There could be healthcare investments, because we know that healthcare leads to higher levels of economic growth because people can simply work if they're not sick. So I think that there are many ways in which the South can reach parity relative to the North. It's a long-run process, but I think it can definitely happen.
Well, I'd like to discuss human capital, which I find very intriguing. You define it on page 4 in your paper. You say it includes intellectual characteristics such as educational attainment and technological skills.
Yes.
So what it made me wonder is, just suppose that the South, the wealthy people in the South, the plantation owners and the slave owners, just suppose they saw that it was in their best interest to educate the slaves, to provide them with an opportunity to learn additional skills and to begin to develop their creativity.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a just suppose. Imagine that happened. Now, do you think that then the South would have improved their economic status, they would have continued to grow, and human capital, which I think you say at some point was about 80% of the cross-country and cross-regional economic variance, would that have resulted in something significantly different? And let's have you imagine what that would be.
Okay, so first I'll just address the numbers that you brought up. Human capital accounts for 1/3 of economic growth. The 80% number means that if you account for human capital in an economic model of long-term growth, with human capital being 1/3, you account for 80% of cross-country differences in income. That's to say it's essentially 80% accurate, which is a much greater improvement upon other models which are 50 or 60% accurate. But to answer your question, absolutely. If the South had a higher level of human capital, then it would do better economically today. There was a very influential.
No.
Pardon? Then?
Would it have done better economically then?
Yes. Because human capital causes growth not only in the short run but in the long run. There's some consistency between the two time frames.
Would you agree that lots of times people, institutions, companies, cultural organizations, they sometimes do what makes sense because it makes them money?
Yes, but in the situation of the American South, paradoxically, economic agents, such as slave owners, were actually doing things that would have cost them money and lost them money in the name of social prestige.
Yeah, so I'm imagining that if they had instead educated the slaves, improved human capital, that perhaps less people would have been against slavery. Perhaps, in fact, they would have embraced it as a terrific thing.
Mm-hmm. So you could probably make that argument that less people would be against slavery, but I don't think it fundamentally changes the abolitionist argumentative standpoint. I think people's objections to slavery is that when you enslave people, you are stripping them of their basic rights to freedom, and I don't think that changes whether or not you educate your slaves.
Good. I think I agree with you. Which brings me to the last point. I've wondered since I've read your paper whether or not this is a bunch of economists just trying to somehow let slave owners off the hook. I mean, these were mean people. These were terrible people. These were people that you wouldn't want to be associated with. I don't think they oftentimes did what they did because of an economic argument or consideration. So what do you think about that?
I think if anything, the argument that my paper presents and arguments that are consistent with what I'm saying actually blame slave owners even more. Because not only were they stripping slaves of their basic human rights, but they were doing things which hurt their posterity, which hurt their region in general. Right? So from a moral standpoint, slavery is obviously bad. But even from an economic standpoint, it's not as great as it was previously thought to be.
So they were mean and ill-advised?
Yes.
Okay. Thinking more so about the psychology behind Southern planters and these decisions they made to their own detriment.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about the Nash equilibrium, which you also mention is very similar to psychological concept of the prisoner's dilemma and sort of a social trap. But in those scenarios, and even in the evidence you provided in the paper, it seemed as though people understood all the possible outcomes and still chose against their best interests. But do you think that the Southern planters understood the long-term consequences of their choices?
I don't think that Southern, obviously economic research has developed greatly over the past 200 or so years after slavery ended, but I don't think we should completely let slave owners off the hook for their economic decisions. After all, they still owned a large amount of capital. They must have had some sort of understanding of the long-run consequences. That's not to say it was perfect, right? We have bounded rationality, we're constrained by intelligence and reason, that sort of thing. But I think certainly they did take them into account at least a little bit. But they were more focused on the social outcomes.
We go along with that. I mean, one of the things that you address on page 9 in your paper is that the Industrial Revolution is happening in the early 19th century in the United States, right? And you talk a little bit about how the North had sort of an advantage in that area because they could get less money back through agriculture, right? Whereas the South, it was the opposite, right? They had an agricultural advantage, right? But if the Industrial Revolution is only happening while these economic agents, these slave owners, are making these decisions, did anybody know that industrialization was going to work in the 1820s and 30s and 40s? Or was it just something that people were trying out to see what advantages it would have?
One second, let me find a relevant passage on my paper.
On page 9, talking about the first full paragraph.
There's a specific statistic. Sure, I'll just go off memory. So I think there's definitely evidence that people in both the North and the South understood the benefits of industrialization. After all, the Industrial Revolution wasn't some sort of abstract trend. It was something that improved the quality of life for people. People were able to achieve a higher standard of living.
False.
What?
A lot of those factory workers lived lives not quite as bad, but very bad, in some cases analogous to slaves.
But I'm talking about economic agents, not factory owners. I mean, not factory workers. The
Oh,
economic
okay.
agents understood that industrialization would lead to a higher standard of living because technology could be developed. And back to the question, I think there's evidence that people in both the North and the South understood the benefits of industrialization because Robert Fogel points out in Time on the Cross that in 1820, industrialization actually started at the same rate in the North as it did in the South, right? It's simply that the North pursued it more, and it turned out that by 1860, the North had increased industrialization by 383%, whereas the South only did so by 73%, I think.
Why?
Why?
Why did that happen?
I think one of the reasons is that the South had more arable farmland, so really from the get-go, they were probably going to shift more towards agriculture. But we can't discount the importance of social incentives, right? Industrialization requires a higher level of technological expertise than does perhaps crude and rudimentary farm work, right? So I think slave owners understood that if they were to industrialize, slaves and African Americans would have a higher level of technological knowledge, which would kind of bridge that vertical prestige gap.
So it would hurt their pride if they were making more money with smart slaves.
Yes.
Okay. Now, this brings me to sort of my other question here. Since we live in a post-industrial world right now, the 21st century, especially here in the United States, industry we sort of farm that outside. In this period, we're talking about industry getting developed and trying to sort of set up its ideas, right? These slave owners in the South, they would probably see that as a foolish investment, but definitely a long-term investment, right? They're not thinking economically. Growth is not their religion.
Mm-hmm.
So let me back up. Today, in a post-industrial economy, we think that if you're not growing, you're dying. Would you agree with that summary?
To some extent. I
Okay.
think
To some extent, if your business is not growing, your economy is not growing, then you are stagnating and dying. How do you think the Southern slave owners thought about their economy? Did they have this issue of grow or die? And then how would that affect their decision making?
Okay, so I think in terms of the long-run perspective, obviously people are not naturally smarter in the North than they were in the South, so they weren't endowed with any more intellectual fortitude than people in the South, right? So I think their ability to think in the long run in the North wasn't any greater than it was in the South. It was simply that in the South there were some incentives that got in the way, right? So I think people in the South care about growth, but it begs the question, how much am I willing to grow if it means that African Americans, people I don't like, are going to get a leg up?
Right, I mean, their idea of growth is more land, more slaves,
Yes.
right? More tools,
And
more
educating
cotton.
slaves gets in the way of that.
Okay. Because each slave becomes more expensive.
So when thinking about the disparity in human capital and its long-term consequences, which lead us to our current North-South regional divergence, where do sort of poor, uneducated white Southerners come into this? Because I would imagine they would also contribute to that lack of human capital in the South, when only really the planter class is hiring private educators and tutors for their children, but surely there are a lot of poor white people who have very rudimentary, if any, education at all.
So if you think about vertical prestige, which was that Southern planters and slave owners wanted to have a high level of prestige relative to people that had a low class in society, that's not exclusive to African Americans, that also might extend to poor white people. Right? So I think that the same incentives are still at play,
Okay.
which also hurt the region's long-term growth.
Do you think they're still at play today?
I mean, I think it's a tough question. Certainly, since there's definitely been a lot of progress in terms of civil rights since 1964 and that kind of thing, I think certainly there are definitely some incentives that are still at play. People aren't completely dissociated from their history, right? There's still some cultural values that might still be evident in the two regions.
See, I kind of view it a little differently. I think that there are very wealthy people in our nation today who would prefer, because of vertical prestige, to keep people without money down low as possible, lacking education, and making sure they don't remain a threat, they don't gain too much financial stability or growth. The divergence between the rich and poor today might be analogous to what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it is. So right now, since 2008, inequality in the United States is measured by the Gini index, which is just this mathematical kind of formulation that I want to get into. Inequality right now is higher than it's been in the United States at any point since the Great Depression, right? So certainly there are some analogous relationships that can be drawn between what we have today and the situation in the South. And a lot of that has to do with what I call the principal agent problem, or what is called the principal agent problem. So in behavioral economics and psychology, the principal agent problem is when you have a principal, which is a person or an entity, and decisions are made for them by an agent. And what often happens is moral hazard, where the agent isn't regulated, therefore the agent does things in their own socially beneficial interest rather than in the interest of the principal. So right now, because we have a high level of inequality, a lot of our capital and wealth is tied up in the hands of a select few. And I think in terms of public policy, what we have to be wary of is those people making decisions for their own benefit and at the detriment of everybody else. Right? So I think that's one of the key points in my paper that can be extrapolated to public policy in the present.
So are we trapped, Tonna?
Are we trapped?
Is this process just going to continue based on your findings in this paper? Do you think the same thing's going to happen again?
I think this process definitely has a tendency to repeat itself because humans are driven by prestige and ambition and that sort of thing. Our challenge as public policymakers is to figure out ways to hold people more accountable and to have them, and to shift their
That
incentives.
sounds like socialism.
I don't think it has to sound like socialism at all. For example, think about the financial crisis of 2008. The reason that it started, the reason that the market crashed and the economy crashed by extension is because we had select few people on Wall Street making decisions and controlling everybody else's money, and they weren't regulated, right?
Exactly.
So they were able to buy bonds and collateralized debt obligations that weren't beneficial for everyone, but would have made them more money on the spread, as they like to call it,
But
right?
the government regulating the stock, the makers of
Yes.
these economic
Understood.
decisions, that is socialism. The government is interfering with the economy.
But when you say socialism, that's a loaded word. Right? I think if I say socialism in the United States right now, people think, oh, exactly, we're going to be Denmark, we're going to be Sweden, that sort of thing. But I think there's some aspects of socialism that can beneficially make their way into any sound economic system, right? As the United States is typically called a capitalist country, that doesn't mean that we should have a purely capitalist system. There's still some macroprudential policies that we can put in place to make sure that people are held accountable, right? And that a select few isn't making decisions for everyone else.
So accountable is controlling their actions and punishing those who aren't controlling. What about incentives? A lot of your paper is about incentive. How can we incentivize, if possible, can we extrapolate from your research, how can we incentivize the 1% to make less stupid decisions in this century?
The two things that you're saying are kind of the same thing. So although controlling, again, it's another loaded word, controlling people and shifting their incentives is often the same thing, right? Controlling people is simply instituting negative incentives, saying if you do this, this is going to happen.
And also about positive incentives.
Positive incentives, true. I think positive incentives is definitely more tricky, and I don't think we necessarily need to have them.
Also, stay negative.
I think we don't have to stay negative in the sense that people should be sad all the time, but I think that the 1% or people who are very wealthy should understand that there are great consequences to the things they do, and if they break the law, then they should be punished for it, right? One of the problems we have right now is that a lot of people on Wall Street or people who control a large amount of capital can make decisions and not feel the legal consequences of
Because
those
they can get
actions.
the laws changed.
Yes, right, so that's a revolving door of government, the corruption issue, another example of the principal agent problem.
So if all humans, in theory, are fallible and will sort of fall prey to the social trap you describe here, who can we trust to regulate other people if, in general, we're all going to act in our self-interest anyways, public policymakers included?
Yeah, so this is like a political theory thing.
Yes.
I saw a quote a couple weeks ago, I can't exactly remember, but it's something along the lines of, we have democracy because there are people in society who need a leg up, but we also have democracy because there are people at the top who we know, or like you said, are not infallible. They're going to make those sorts of harmful decisions. So I think this all goes back to having what MIT economist Darren Acemoglu calls inclusive political institutions. Political institutions that promote economic growth, but at the same time hold people accountable and ensure that all people have some sort of opportunity to achieve their aspirations.
What would this look like? Are you talking about like free press, freedom of speech, shooting rich people? I mean,
Shooting rich people.
Talking about
Yeah, I'll hold on the last one.
an
But
economically representative Congress?
yeah, I mean, things like free speech, free press, freedom of religion, all the sorts of things that we have here are certainly beneficial
Used
to
to have
democracy.
here.
Used to. Can you what's it called? Qualify that opinion?
Yeah, I do, because I see that the press is being held to high standards of so-called fake news. And the line is being drawn between what's fake news and what's not fake news in order to intimidate the press, to stop their
critique.
critique. Good.
Yeah, and this goes back to the discussion of inequality that we had a few minutes ago. Inequality is higher than it's been in almost 100 years. And one of the social fallouts of that is that political power is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few people, and that extends to controlling wealth, but to also controlling free press and free speech. So what you said is correct. It's certainly a problem that is becoming worse today. But that doesn't mean that our political system is necessarily moribund. It's not doomed. It's just that reform can be made, and I think our system certainly has some key tenets that are conducive to that.
If I can, let me just ask you to comment on this. If we have a situation where we have this great divergence, and then we have people who are wealthy who are attempting to control those who are not by limiting what they can do or what they have financially the money to do,
In the stronger region or in the weaker region?
Which region are you talking about?
You said people are going to be controlling other people. And that's
Yeah, I believe that the 1% or the
Yeah,
2% are trying to control those who are the lower middle class or the lower class. And with that going on, what I'm thinking about is these individuals who are attempting to do this are essentially minimizing what you call human capital.
Mm-hmm.
And they're doing that even though they are motivated by greed and wealth and control. So do you think they're falling right in the same path as the plantation owners were way back during the days of slavery?
I think the social dynamics are a little bit different, but yes, I think they're certainly falling in the same trap. The arguments that I made in my paper aren't necessarily exclusive to the system of American slavery. They can be extrapolated to other analogous situations, one of which is the high level of inequality we see today. Because the principle behind this is that when a small select group of people control capital and wealth and influence, then they can do things in their own benefit and to the detriment of other people. Right? And that principle applies to any situation in which there's a high degree of inequality in a society and in which the people at the bottom cannot get a leg up.
So that might also apply then to sort of this global phenomenon of girls being generally boxed out of education.
Yeah,
That
so
apply?
I had a discussion with a brilliant scholar this morning that brought up that in Saudi Arabia, women are often stripped of what you might call fundamental rights. Only recently were they able to drive. They often can't vote in some elections. They can't serve in government, right? And even though allowing them to take part in the political process would increase Saudi Arabia's level of human capital and by extension its standard of living and rate of economic growth, right? There's still a select few in their society that control most of the political power, and thus they're making decisions based on their own social incentives rather than on sound, rational reasoning, right?
And surely you see that in other countries too, right? You take Thailand, take Kenya, take any amount of countries where you're seeing, right, girls don't get educated past, say, the third or fourth grade education in favor of the boy, or because the idea is that girls don't need to be educated past a certain point. The model would still stand, correct, that the human capital is then limited, and so that country is not going to be able, or that region will not be able to reach its full potential, or even possibly the country, if you have arguably half its population not learning.
Yeah, absolutely, because the nefarious incentives that I detail in my paper are about inequality and disparities in general. It's not just rich versus poor. It can be gender-based. It can be based on any sort of difference in inequality that we see in society. So the model would still stand correct.
If I can, I want to tell you what I like most about your research. What it does is it quantifies into things that people care about. Money. It makes the report card on our actions become economic growth. And in my life experience, that's what people care about the most. Even though you could spend a lifetime trying to convince them that how much money you make, how much money you have, what kind of car you drive, the size of your house, what your career is, has nothing to do with who you are and your value as a person. Mm-hmm. It has to do with the kind of decisions that you make, moral decisions, integrity, your character. There's many people, particularly people who have money, who will not buy into that argument. Their report card is how much money have I made? How has the economy been doing? How well are we as a nation doing economically? Your paper and your theory gives them that report card. Maybe we can get people to do the right thing for the wrong reasons.
Yes, so, thank you, but on the policy solutions, or on the solutions generally that my paper presents, I think they're multifaceted because they don't just deal with economic growth, which is what people care about, but they also deal with social incentives, right? I think as a society, the way to move forward is not only to grow, which is something that can happen with human capital, but it's also to achieve a situation, or to reach a situation in which all people are included in a political system, right? I think the message of my paper is that if people are not included in a system, then economic growth suffers. So for people of either mindset, right, focus on money only, or focus on only social justice, there's something in this paper that can speak to you, or that's communicable to your standpoint.
Agreed.
So I've got another question for you. It's 30 years in the future, right? It's,
Yes.
it's 2048, you are president, you have a majority in both Senate and Congress, right? Based on the research you've done, and assuming the trends don't radically change in the next 30 years, what would you do to grow the American economy,
So
based on your research here?
right now, in the political sphere, discussions about the American economy focus on the wrong thing. We focus on trade and on immigration, that sort of thing, and how that can affect wages. But what needs to be put into the public focus is human capital, right? For example, in 1992, there was a paper by Greg Mankiw which found that, as I said before, human capital accounts for 1/3 of growth, right? But in the political system, we don't think about that enough. And the number one way to grow human capital, and by extension economic growth, is through education, right? So education needs to become more inclusive. There needs to be a higher level of access for people on the low end of the economic spectrum to reach a high level of income, because as is often said, we're missing a lot of Einsteins as a society. The people who have very impressive natural characteristics that are conducive to economic success, but they're not given the opportunity to do that, right? So as a society, what needs to happen is educational reform. That way people who are on the bottom of a society can have an opportunity to get a leg up and contribute to the American political game, if you call it.
Do you have any more questions? So Tonna, as a final question, what should, say for example, all of your peers and classmates here who, let's take out people who are interested in economics or public policy. So for a layperson, if you will, what can an individual do with this information? What message would you like to leave our audience with? Assuming they don't care anything about economics or public policy.
There are immense consequences to many of the things that we do in our everyday lives, right? Not just relating to our incomes or our intelligence or our grades, but also in just the way we treat people and the way that we make others feel included as a society, right? So if we have a society in which people are not included and people are not given an opportunity, the onus is on us to do something to change that, right? Right, be the change you wish to see in the world. That's the common phrase that's used. But it's not just some sort of liberal platitude, as people like to say. It actually leads to economic growth. It actually benefits everybody as a whole, right? So I think that's something that my paper at least attempts to drive home. And that's something that's relevant for anyone who reads this paper and is, as you would say, a layman.
Thank you.